Celebrations in Tigray after rebel forces retake the regional capital from government troops. Tigrayan forces have delivered a humiliating blow to Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. But will the government's unilaterally declared ceasefire actually pave a road to peace or buy time for all sides to prepare for more fighting? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the rebel recapture of Mekelle. Well, 8 months into a war that Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed said would restore law and order to the northern Tigray region, we're instead seeing the creation of an unimaginable humanitarian crisis. And it's threatening to destabilize much of the Horn of Africa. Government forces fighting alongside Amhara and Eritrean militia are accused of atrocities including mass rape and ethnic cleansing. Millions have fled to neighbouring Sudan, and the entire region stands now on the brink of famine. Less than 2 years after receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, Abiy's reputation as a peacemaker has been replaced with something closer to warmonger. Well, stories of atrocities are fueling the ranks of the Tigray Defense Forces, seemingly pushing the battle beyond provincial borders. The Guardian newspaper reports long convoys of troops loyal to the Tigray People's Liberation Front redeploying to fight militia from the neighboring Amhara region. Despite declaring a unilateral ceasefire, Abiy boasts of recruiting 1 million new fighters for battle over the next few months. Now, the TPLF has tentatively accepted the ceasefire on the condition that they be recognized as the region's legitimate government. They're also demanding the complete withdrawal of all Eritrean forces and Amhara militia who backed federal troops. And they're calling for a UN investigation into alleged war crimes carried out during the conflict. But it remains to be seen if those conditions will be met and if any semblance of peace will return to the region. So, to discuss what may be to come in Ethiopia, I'm joined from New York by Mastewal Taddese Terefe. She is a lawyer who specializes in the rule of law and governance and formerly worked in Ethiopia's Federal Attorney General's office. From Addis Ababa, we have Hailu Kebede. He is the head of foreign affairs for the Salsay Weyane party, Tigray party. And Mesenbet Asefa is an assistant professor of law at Addis Ababa University. Thanks all so much for being with us. Greatly appreciated. So the government declared the cessation of hostilities. We've seen people in Mekelle celebrating victory, but it is still not clear at all if fighting will return and to what degree. So Mastewal, I'll start with you. Do you think anyone is actually committed to a political solution at this point, or does what we're seeing now only represent a pause in all-out war?
I think the latter, Andra. So the actions of the parties in this war since this unilateral ceasefire was declared by the federal government suggests that it is a pause of some form from the federal government side. And the Tigrayans have, in principle, accepted that unilateral ceasefire, but have set a set of preconditions for a negotiated ceasefire. The actions by the federal government and the rhetoric also coming out of the prime minister and the military personnel suggest that this is some form of military retreat that is going to be followed up by a form of additional mobilization. The prime minister yesterday in his latest address to parliament mentioned that 1 million youths could be mobilized in the coming months if needed, or the military personnel were saying that they could recapture Mekelle if they wanted anytime. So there is a sense that, the parties realize that a political solution is what will address this issue sustainably, but they are very far apart in terms of how they are, willing to, in good faith, negotiate towards that. So, yeah.
Right. So the ceasefire actually just buys time to regroup. Hailu Kebede, let me ask you, do Tigrayans ultimately want stronger autonomy, or do they want independence? Because it seems like the further this war progresses, the louder those calls for independence become.
Well, thank you. First of all, I would like to second Mastewal's idea on this ceasefire issue. The government was forced out of Tigray, so it is a tactic to rearrange, regroup, train the youth, as the Prime Minister clearly stated it in his address to the parliament. So there is no, feature in ceasefire or some kind of political negotiation, as the war is driven by the Amhara elites, and the Amhara regional government president has declared clearly that he is still in war with the Tigrayans. So I don't see a ceasefire in the coming, short period of time. But, to come to your second question, the Tigrayans have assertively, addressed that the issue should be settled with a kind of referendum. So the decision will be given to the public. But as we can see from the general public, from the public opinion, from the political parties that have a huge mass support, I don't see it, the Tigrayans, continuing as part of the Ethiopian Federation. But let's give that chance to the public. The public should decide, and there should be a referendum after either there is a military victory or any kind of negotiated ceasefire and agreement, political settlement.
Okay. Interesting that you call for a referendum, but the government obviously did not take kindly for Tigrayans holding an election that they felt they had not authorized. But it's interesting that you say the Amhara elitists are actually driving this war more so than the government. Is that what I'm understanding?
Well, the government is narratively controlled by these Amhara elites, which has the luxury to have this public opinion for the last 100 years in this imperial country. So when you look into the war, it is a geographical, political, and economical crushing of Tigray. When you see a chunk of land in the western Tigray and southern Tigray being incorporated not only by the Amhara forces, but in support of the Ethiopian army and the arch-enemy of the Tigrayans, the Eritrean army, it is clear that the war is driven, narratively and with all its practice by the Amhara elites and by the Amhara medias, and the government. The Ethiopian Prime Minister already endorsed it, because he was saying that the western parts of Tigray were part of Bege Midir, as he called it. And the Ethiopian ambassador to the United Nations has seconded this idea and accepted that these lands were ancestral lands of the Amharas. So this is a war driven by the Amharas, and the Prime Minister is just, the messenger here.
Okay, very interesting. Mesenbet, we heard Mastewal saying that, as far as a political solution is actually concerned, all sides are really too far apart to get close to finding any agreement on a peace deal right now. So tell us what Abiy Ahmed, what the government actually wants, and are his supporters behind him in his ultimate goals, even if it means more fighting?
Thank you, Andrea. I think, first of all, we have to point out that the ceasefire that was announced by the government is a very good gesture, because for me, many said it was because of military strategy and tactics, but I think we have to understand that also Tigray is currently in a very dire humanitarian situation. So if the conduct of hostilities continues, civilians will continue to be haunted. There is an element of starvation and lack of food, medical care, and essential services in Tigray. So I think it was partly the government felt responsible, partly because of the international pressure, partly also because of the continuing civilian damage that is being sustained in Tigray because of the irresponsible acts of TPLF. So that is, I think, a very important point to note, and the ceasefire, for me, should be accepted without any condition, I think, given the very extreme dire humanitarian situation in the ground in Tigray. Regarding political settlements, I think every kind of conflict and political confrontation should ultimately lead to some plausible form of political settlement. As Mastewal said, currently, political positions are very hardened. The conflict has, taken a racialized or ethnic kind of tone, and this has made it very difficult. So attempts should be made, I think, to engage, but finding political solutions would not be easy, but there should be attempts, at least to engage with, Tigrayans who feel that their future belongs in Ethiopia, partly with the diaspora, and Tigrayans living here in Taddese and other parts of Ethiopia. They have every right to take part in Ethiopia's political future. But, we have to also take into account that TPLF ruled Ethiopia for almost 30 years with a very authoritarian stance and highly sectarian, almost that racialized Ethiopian society by ethnicity and fixed identity. The democratic trajectory of the state was severely affected, and our social fabric was hugely affected.
Right.
So if we are thinking Ethiopia's political future, I think we need to be thinking about the more comprehensive political problems that we are facing currently in Ethiopia, not only in Tigray, and finding a viable path for Ethiopia's future.
So in deciding the future, though, you also believe a lot of history really does need to be considered as well. But in the end, you don't think Abiy Ahmed will really meet any of the TPLF's demands? Let me just clarify that. Yes or no?
Because some of the preconditions are really laughable. I mean, if you are leading a rebel group which is trying to topple the government, you cannot request electricity, water, and other, kinds of. So TPLF is trying to play both sides. If they are going to engage within the political process, they have to engage within the democratic process, which is that they have to lay down arms and maybe find a negotiated settlement. So, but when you have like millions of starving Tigrayans in Tigray, I think it's absolutely irresponsible to even consider many preconditions set by TPLF. And some of them are, like I said, very laughable. For the immediate humanitarian situation that is very dire in Tigray, the ceasefire should be taken as, I think, an important step in finding political solution and solving also the humanitarian crisis.
Okay. Mastewal, we're really hearing a little bit more about Tigrayan intransigence from Abiy Ahmed's camp's perspective. And the bottom line is we're already talking about, one of the worst humanitarian crises on the planet right now. So if fighting continues, which it sounds like it's set to continue, what will there be left to fight for if hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people are left to starve?
Yeah, it is very concerning what the next chapter of this war will look like. Both Mesebet and Hailu mentioned that now the war is going to be also centered around ethnic groups' alleged entitlement to disputed areas in Western Tigray. And that has the potential to turn the war into a very serious civil war that will claim many more lives than we have already lost in 8 months. But I want to push back on something that Mesebet mentioned earlier, which is that the notion that this war was launched because TPLF insisted on a military confrontation over political issues. My take is that, despite the long list of official objectives and justifications that Prime Minister and people like Mesebet give you for why the war started and why it's being fought, the real answer has actually been articulated yesterday by Prime Minister Abiy himself in his address to Parliament. He mentioned that this war could have been avoided if TPLF simply just joined the new Prosperity Party that Prime Minister Abiy put together in 2019 or since the transition, and that, had they joined this party, they would have been able to keep their power, their stolen money and whatnot. And that just gives away the real intent, really, of this war. And this is a political contestation for power between Prime Minister Abiy and TPLF on the one hand, and then allied forces who have various grievances against TPLF, like people like Mesebet, who believe that TPLF is responsible for all the ills in Ethiopia. All the worst things that happen in the country can be attributed to TPLF, some people tend to believe, and others who, like I mentioned, have disputed territories that on the border between Amhara and Tigray. So there is a war currently being fought on, in the name of, Ethiopian territorial integrity. But the underlying issue is ideological differences between TPLF's vision for Ethiopia, which is a much more, multi-ethnic or a federation based on ethnic identity that emphasizes linguistic identity, and one camp of Ethiopians that believe that a more geographic federation is fit for Ethiopia. So these differences are what are driving the current, bloody wars in Ethiopia, and they have to stop. And one way to stop them is for people like Mesembet to finally sit down and accept that there are people who support TPLF in Tigray. They have shown that in 8 months, that TPLF has massive popular support. And it's not just TPLF, but Oromos and other ethnic groups in Ethiopia believe in the vision that TPLF represents. So to keep Ethiopia moving forward, we have to come back to a negotiated settlement about what future we want.
That is absolutely unacceptable. I think what Mastewal said.
I think there is a paradox between.
Hold on, let me let Mesembet respond quickly, since the comments were directed to him. Go ahead, Mesembet.
Thank you, Andrea, because I think Mastewal singled out some of the problems. We have to understand. I think everybody understands that there are ideological differences currently, but TPLF has lost moral, political legitimacy in Ethiopia's political governance. 30 years of TPLF leadership has taken Ethiopia into a more, not only authoritarian, more like totalitarian control of economy, military, political power in Ethiopia. The things that you mentioned, the linguistic diversity, cultural diversity, any kind of conditional democracy would accept these terms. I think that's not the problem. The problem with TPLF is that since they toppled the Derg in 1991, they had controlled every entire public, not only public life, even private life, So it's really laughable for anyone that closely followed up Ethiopian political landscape for the past 30 years. TPLF has used ethnic mobilization as a means of political control in Ethiopia. And of course, that doesn't mean that there are political forces that support the ethnic identity and that sort of element. But that can be captured for any political society that aspires to be democratic and free. Democracy gives you that. And I believe within the constitutional democratic contestation, that can be accommodated. But TPLF has lost every political legitimacy. This is something very consistent that you see from Somali region to Oromia to Amhara to many regions. And I think that's also the problem with Tigray is that there has to be other voices coming.
I think the paradox...
People like Hailu, you are my brother. You have to have a very sound vision for Tigray that can make it part of the political dispensation in Ethiopia. With the fixed, dangerous political narrative that you have in Tigray, led by TPLF, I don't see any future, to be honest.
Hailu, go ahead.
I will give a chance to Hailu to explain. But
I think you should give me a chance. I think Mr. Mesembet is somehow delusioned with what he's talking about TPLF and everything, what he's saying about democracy and everything, as if we have democracy. And while his prime minister is leading a genocidal war in Tigray, he's talking about democracy and other things, luxurious things. We as a people, as a Tigrayan, are living in a dire situation of a genocidal campaign.
Political governance.
Let me finish. I think I let you to finish.
I think I let you to finish. Let Hailu finish. It's very difficult to hear both of you with the connections. Go ahead, Hailu.
Let me finish my pointers. From the very beginning, his first comment that his paradox that while the Ethiopian government was, declaring officially in the mid-June that they are pursuing for a final offensive in Tigray, and while the Tigrayan side was, counter-offensive, the Alula operation. So there was no gesture for the Tigrayans in the last 8 months. There was an ill intention to exterminate the people of Tigray. It was a genocidal war. It was a military campaign. It was a political destruction. The prime minister told us that Mekelle, the second biggest city in Ethiopia, was downgraded, which is Bashasha, maybe thousands of residents, which is...
Okay, it seems we're having some issues with
the political entity of Tigray, politically, geographically, and economically. But now, Mr.
Hailu, I'll tell you
about TPLF rule. And TPLF never ruled Ethiopia alone. It ruled with its allied forces.
Okay, so Hailu, we're having some issues with your
last 30 years
connection.
Andrea, can I respond? I think
a quick response, Mesembet. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the wider world, I think, should understand that Abiy Ahmed, nobody says Abiy Ahmed's political leadership is, absolutely correct. There might be fault lines, but he gets it right in many things. And when it comes to Tigray, the way he handled it, there might be problems initially, but I think TPLF, it's clear that from the records, even the generals that launched the attack on the Northern Zone Command in Tigray have admitted that they launched the military attack. So for them, when they saw that there was a political change taking place in Ethiopia,
with the Eritreans, with the Amharas, with the Ethiopian army, it was a self-defense. If the whole entire Ethiopian army is surrounding you on the Amhara borders, sabotaging and conspiring with with a neighboring region within the federation, and with an arch enemy in the north, with the Eritreans, what options do you have? Are you telling me that they should have been slaughtered in their own city? That's what you are saying.
That is not the case. TPLF, because of the greedy political ambitions of TPLF, millions of Tigrayans are now currently under.
I'm not talking about TPLF. I am talking about Tigray as a Tigrayan, as a proud Tigrayan, as a very.
Andrea, if I may,
your hate towards TPLF is clouding your judgment. I'm not talking about TPLF. I am an ardent critic of TPLF. I cannot defend TPLF, but as a Tigrayan, as a proud Tigrayan, we were encircled before November 4. In fact, Eritreans were inside Sorona front, for example, before November 4. So what you are saying is the government narration, the government media narration. I was in Tigray. We know what was happening. We know what was coming on. The whole Ethiopian army was on the southern border of Tigray, and the Eritreans were already inside Tigray before November 4. So the Amhara Police Commission head told us that he was conspiring against Tigray with the Ethiopian army. They were ready to launch an offensive from the southern
I'll tell you
front.
what, there seems to be, we're seeing how extreme the perspectives are on actually what happened, what led to this conflict, what continues to fuel this conflict. Unfortunately, we do have very limited time, and we need to discuss something very important before I let all three of you go, and that is, however far away it might be, a political solution is what will ultimately bring peace to Ethiopia. Mastewal, I'll start with you. What form could any political solution actually come in? And is it fair to actually discuss a potential balkanization of Ethiopia?
It breaks my heart to be talking about exactly that, the balkanization of Ethiopia, the breakup of a country that had so much hope in 2018. The entire world has seen how excited all Ethiopians were about the prime minister coming to power and his promise to all Ethiopians, irrespective of their political differences, that he would transition the country, help us transition into a democratic space. So it breaks really my heart that we're now talking about disintegration. But the reality is, no matter how many times the prime minister and his propagandists and people who support him say that Ethiopia will prevail despite this carnage that's happening in Tigray, the reality elsewhere in Ethiopia, not in Tigray, will show you that there's a serious risk of disintegration. Oromia had been in war front for 2 years. We're not talking about it as much because the war there takes a different form. But it's not just Oromia. Other opponents of the prime minister, including in the capital city, Addis Ababa, who represent a different vision or who challenge his political power, have been locked up for political reasons. So what we have to really, understand, like people like Masembe, for example, who may have supported the war in November because they didn't understand maybe the implications of it, is really come to terms with the fact that the prime minister's mandate in 2018 was to help Ethiopians transition to a more tolerant political pluralism, one that accommodates ideological differences and builds on institutions that accommodate those differences. It's not to implement the prime minister's vision of one Ethiopia the way he defines it. So for all of us to come together towards that solution, we need to craft a very well-designed, inclusive national dialogue. And this is something that international partners can help Ethiopia with. But there has to be a serious political commitment from the prime minister and those forces in Addis Ababa who could hijack this process as another, photo opportunity for a dialogue. But this really has to be one that looks at the constitution and other, land and administrative disputes that exist as problems that can be solved through a compromise solution. Every political party, including those in prison like Jawar Mohammed and Iskandar Nega, for their political opinions, need to be freed. And they need to come to an inclusive political process whereby their ideas and their visions can be factored into a compromise solution for Ethiopia, whether that's a new constitution or an amendment to the constitution or a new type of political settlement that will solve these problems. So I really urge people like Mesembet to really stop this notion that, it's just TPLF that's the problem. That's not the problem. Oromia is not in war because TPLF is instigating it. Amhara and ethnic groups, Amhara people are not being massacred in all parts of Ethiopia because TPLF is masterminding it. This is self-delusion, and that self-delusion from the prime minister is festering into a national delusion, actually, and it's paralyzing us.
Mesembet, quick, and I stress very quick response.
Yeah, Andrea, thank you. I think every political action, entails a moral responsibility. For me, whatever is happening in Tigray, solely the responsibility is taken by TPLF. TPLF attacked its own national army. No other worldly force, I don't know, any other jurisdiction has done that.
Unfortunately, the clock is very much against us. We're over time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd really like to thank all three of you so much for joining us, and I apologize for having to cut this conversation short. Thank you, of course, to our viewers as well for tuning in. We'll see you next time.